Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
Hi, this is Tammy Patzer, and I am happy to introduce you to author-publisher Kristina Jacobs. Kristina has a very unique background, and she is the publisher of the Next Level Publishing Company, and she has written or ghostwritten or published more than 100 books to date. Welcome, Kristina.
Thanks, Tammy, and hello to everybody. I'm happy to be here talking to you today.
Thanks. Well, let's just start out and give me a little bit of a background about you and your writing. Where do you live, and primarily, why do you write?
Well, I live in a really tiny town with less than 2,000 people in Minnesota called Lester Prairie, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, several hours from the Twin Cities. And so it's a good environment if you're going to be a writer, because these days you can do a lot of writing and publishing all online. So you don't need to be in a big city like New York or Los Angeles, the way it may have been a long time ago before the internet and online publishing platforms. I started really writing seriously back in 2011. I had always kind of dabbled and written children's stories and short stories, but I never really did anything with them. And then I had a big scare where my computer melted down, and I realized that unless I really did something with these stories, even if my intent was only to publish them for my own friends and family, they could easily be lost and never see the light of day just from a random computer malfunction. And so that kind of set me off on a track that led places where I had no idea it was going to go, which was really just researching what was out there if I wanted to put my stories together and have copies of the books printed. So this is, in the infancy, before there were all these different choices and platforms, when I started researching this. And then eventually over the years, that's really grown into an entire publishing house because I started doing this work for other people.
So tell me a little bit about the books that you've written and published, because I know that they span from children's fantasy stories to poetry chapbooks. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about what you do for other people. So tell me about the books you've written.
Well, my very first book was a collection of short stories. And the funny thing is a lot of those stories got written when I was going to school. And, I would be waiting for a class to start, or, sometimes we'd be on class break and I'd be scribbling in my notebook to entertain myself, because I have the kind of mind that is continually running and thinking and needs something to do. And stories would just pop into my head. And so I'd write them down. But because of the time constraints I was under working and going to school, and I had very small children at the time, I needed something. I couldn't write full-length books or chapters. I needed something quick. Short stories or poetry that you can really just kind of squeeze into the corners of your days and then keep it somewhere together until you have enough to actually become a collection. So Tales of the Weird was my very first book. It was published in 2011. It was a print book and a Kindle book, available on Amazon and also in regular bookstores like Barnes & Noble. And it actually did very well, but it was an adventure in learning how to do things, because that book I self-published, and it was a short story book, and so I had to learn from the ground up everything about book formatting and making a cover and writing a blurb for the back of your cover to sell the book, and how to actually use the software to get the book created and have it printed. And then the big thing was learning how to actually market books to sell them if you decide that you want to do more than just have it available for your own family and friends. At that time, I also had several children's stories that I had written many years earlier, and they were just sitting around. And so I kind of went on some adventures, and I had written a story at the very beginning of college called Simbala the Mighty and Mimba the Wanderer. And I took that story and I worked with an illustrator to do the cover. And then later I collaborated with that illustrator, Mark Weaver, to create another book called Orion and the Land of Tomatoes. And those are both my children's books. As the years went on, I really started focusing more on poetry. I have 5 poetry chapbooks now. And the last two that I published were just at the very, very end of 2015. I released a poetry chapbook called Inside Invisible and another poetry chapbook called Dawn After Dusk. And so they're different themes. Dawn After Dusk is more about relationships and, kind of growing, not necessarily romantic relationships. And Inside Invisible is some more fantasy poetry, and it really goes a lot more with stories that are written about science fiction and fantasy. So those are the most recent books that I've published for myself. I know that you had asked me about work that I do for other people. I've been involved for several years now with a large group of business owners and marketers and doing all different types of writing work for them. And that really grew from things that a lot of publicists would do, like writing press releases for them and marketing materials, into doing full-length ghostwritten books or editing books for their clients who might be like a doctor or a dentist. So they've written a book, but they don't know how to format it and edit it.
So you will take either somebody's written material and help them to ghostwrite what they've got, or do you do other types of projects too, like interviewing and things like that?
It really just depends. If a lot of times there might be someone who comes to me and they have a client who they don't have a book, but they have lots of existing materials that it's just because that's their specialty. So they've already have maybe a manual that they use at their office and maybe some PowerPoint presentations, information that they give as a handout or a brochure. So they have some information that I can use, but probably not enough to create an entire book from. So we do start with that, but then I would actually then work with that person as the subject matter expert and interview them and record the interviews and transcribe the interviews and essentially develop all of the missing pieces, kind of pick their brain and figure out, okay, I might come to them with a book plan before we did our first interviews, and we would kind of hash out how we wanted the chapters to be laid out. And then all of my interviews from then would just be focusing on questions to get the information I would need to write the chapter.
So how long does it typically take to, well, obviously a whole book would be different, but let's say somebody needed to get a chapter put together. What would that process look like if I was somebody who wanted to just be interviewed and have you pull out the stuff out of my head and then you help me with my chapter, or maybe even write a full book?
Well, if it was a chapter, like maybe you have one chapter in a larger book with other people, that would be a common scenario. I usually would interview somebody for an hour, no more than an hour and a half. But before we got to the point of that interview, we would have had a conversation where they could send me any materials they had. I would check out things like their LinkedIn to get some information, and I would come up with questions that are actually sent before the interview. And that's always very helpful, so that it's very hard sometimes to talk off the top of your head if that's not your talent. And so it gives people time to review what the questions are, to think about how they want to answer and what they want to share. And then we're really maximizing the hour to hour and a half that we would have on the phone to get the information for a chapter. Once I've, listened to the interview and transcribed the interview and turned that into the chapter, along with the information, PowerPoints or brochures or anything that was sent to me, I would send that back, and then they would be going over it kind of as the subject matter expert. For example, I've interviewed a dentist before. And for the most part, as you're writing a chapter and you're the writer, you're making everything flow nicely, but you do want them to reread it and make sure that since you're not a dentist, you haven't accidentally changed something that now makes it incorrect. So usually if you get changes back, it's something like that where they'll say, well, that's not quite how it is. And it could be maybe from your interview that they didn't clarify and you discovered you needed it. But the changes aren't usually real complicated. Usually it's just kind of, they're the expert and they might see little things that they're like, oh, if my colleagues read that, I want to make sure it's clear. And then you fix those up and they've approved their chapter to go in their book. So it's really a collaborative process, but it doesn't require a lot of time from the person for a chapter. Like I said, doctors and dentists and chiropractors and pest control and a lot of service professions will go through the interview process rather than trying to write a chapter themselves. because it's just easier for them and more convenient. It's a lot easier to tell somebody about what you've done as your life's work than it is to try to write it down if you're not a writer.
Oh, it's even difficult if you are a writer, because it's just time consuming. And most people, what I find is that most people, when they're telling a story to someone else, they don't edit themselves as they tell the story. But if you're writing it down or typing it, you will stop and edit yourself and try to fix it as you go. So something that you could have dumped out on the page in a couple minutes, you end up spending hours on because you're judging yourself so quickly. I want to go back and ask you some questions about some of your projects that you're working on, because it's very interesting how a writer publisher produces. You said that you learned how to create the books, meaning, what does that mean exactly when you said that you had to learn to create the books on Amazon? I know we have a lot of people who maybe are not familiar with how self-publishing works nowadays.
Well, back in the day, the main players were Lulu.com and CreateSpace.com. CreateSpace is owned by Amazon, and they both offer a format for an electronic book. They both offer format for having print books created, POD, which is a short acronym for Print on Demand. Which means that when someone goes online and they found my book for some marketing channel that they found out about it, and they click order, Amazon then prints that book on their side. They do the distribution and the printing and mails it out. And then I would get whatever I've set. I set the price, I set the royalty. If it's my own book, then, the royalty will be deposited into my account. And you just use automatic deposit. If it's for a client, it'll be deposited into my publishing account, and then the royalties would be distributed about 4 times a year. And so, that's one of the differences, is if I'm doing it for a client, they're not really self-publishing. They have,
right.
Sure, and they get normal royalty distributions like any other writer would, and in sales reports to let them know. And in my case, I'm kind of a hybrid publishing house, very small. Any marketing that we're doing is collaborative marketing. So I may promote, but they're expected to also promote their own work. A lot of the people that I work with, though, selling books randomly on Amazon is not their purpose for creating a book. Their purpose is, for example, a chiropractor might want to be seen as an expert in their field, and they want to stand out and be different. Maybe there's 4 other chiropractors in town, or 5 or 10 that they're competing with. And having a book to position themselves as an expert is one of the ways that they can do that. And so they'll actually take their books and order print books to keep in their office, either to sell for a very nominal amount or to just give away. And then, the idea is people don't usually throw away books. They may eventually donate books to a thrift store, and then thrifty people go and buy them there. And so it's almost like a business card. It's a calling card with your name on it that says that you know what you're talking about. Everybody who reads the book, when they learn about your procedures or the knowledge that you have, then can decide, versus this other chiropractor that I don't know anything about, I want to go to this person who told me all this good information about how to fix my back. So that's an example of kind of how they're using it. It's not the same as somebody, like in my own writing, when I'm making children's stories, or I'm making poetry. It's a completely different audience. So, kind of different business model.
Right. And I did want to ask you about, I did some pre-reading of some of your books, and the book that I read was The Adventures of Sample Girl. And I just want you to tell us a little bit about what prompted that book, because to tell you the truth, it was hilarious. And I think that it was just a good example of taking some real life scenarios and seeing the humorous side of life. And I just want you to talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. The Adventures of Sample Girl it's a collection of little vignettes. So they're even shorter than short stories, and they're based on a true story. And I have several of my short collections that are in some way based on a true story, because it's a type of writing that I'm interested in. It doesn't mean it's, 100% factual. It's like you said, it's seeing life in a certain lens, whether it's being humorous or just picking out the things that, strike you as being important, kind of out of the larger picture. And when I was in school, I was working for the University of Minnesota, and when you're teaching, you have a 9-month contract. So every summer I would get dumped off because you don't want to take a regular job because you're going back to work in the fall. And in my case, I'm going back to work in the fall full time every year. And I knew that I was going to be doing that for 6 or 7 years as I worked on my PhD. And so you want to take a job so you can make some money over the summer, but you don't want it to be one that you're afraid to leave. And so I would find tutoring jobs. And one summer I found out about a sample job, sample girl. So as in the sample people that you see at the grocery store who have their apron on and they have their little table and they're offering you whatever the product is, whether it's, a new type of cracker or a new type of drink. And the nice thing about those types of jobs is you can go in if you're working for a company that provides that service to the grocery store and just tell them kind of on your own, yes, the store is close enough for me, and yes, I'm going to work this weekend. And then you go and do your job, and you might be there for 4 hours, you might be there for 8. So it's not a whole lot of hours, but it's real flexible if you're just looking like I was for a summer job. And there's a great variety of people who take this type of job. You have to be friendly and you have to be nice, but there could be people there who are, just 18 years old all the way up to seniors. You'll see some people who are interested in food preparation or cooking in that field, and a lot of people like me who that was maybe their second job or a third job or a side job where they were saving up for something. And so those vignettes were all these crazy things that would happen when I would take these jobs. And, I've always thought about maybe doing a sample girl too, because I didn't actually use all the stories that were put together in that original book. And it's one of my most popular books. It has a lot of reviews on Amazon, and everybody who reads it is like, "Oh, these are like so true to life." So that's. Can
you share one of the examples from the story from that book?
Well, let's see. Off the top of my head, well, I don't know if I should share this example. It's maybe a little political, but we were serving ham slices with some type of fancy mustard on them, and it came on a cracker. So it was kind of like a little bite, and you're offering. And for some reason, it was very clear to me that whoever ordered whatever was being offered as samples that day did not think about what was going on in the political climate at the time, where they were, what store this was. We'll call it the Big T is where it was. And this is in Minnesota, so that's where the headquarters of the Big T is. And there had been a recent, at the time, issue with the Big T and their cashiers who were Muslim being allowed or not allowed to wear their headscarves. And it relates to this story because we were in a very, very densely populated store with a large Muslim shopping population, a store that had just recently been on the news, like the particular store, for having this really hotbed issue. And you were required as a sample person to offer this ham, pork, to every single person who walked by, no matter what. And you're put in this awkward position because you're like, well, I don't want to offer them something that I know that they can't have. And it's not fair that I know that visually because the women might be wearing the hijab, but I also don't want to put them in the awkward position of like, why are you offering me this? And so it's just kind of watching, how I had to figure out how to handle that, how customers figured out how to handle that. I mean, there was some people like, what was left to offer them if they can't have the ham was mustard on a cracker. So it's not very, very appetizing. And so you're just trying to figure out, how do I handle this volatile situation when you're just in your little sample girl job. So I had a lot of just funny, strange things that would happen to me randomly. I know, like I said, I read that and I laughed out loud. Like it was like
ha 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 all the way through this book. And so I think that, people definitely should look at that because like you said, it is a little slice of life. And sometimes we do get put into these awkward situations. And like you said, what do you do when you're put into this awkward situation? So I really did think that was hilarious. And then another book of yours that really stands out to me, and I believe it's called Musicians Wanted. Can you talk a little bit about that book? That to me is probably one of the most unique books I've ever seen or heard of.
Well, Musicians Wanted was this project that really came about because in addition to writing poetry and short stories, and I'm working on some longer stories, but since I don't have a big steady blocks of time, I usually come out with my shorter stories sooner. I write songs. And so, songs, lyrics will just come to me, like fully formed. I can hear the music in my head. The problem is I have no ability to write down what I hear in my head. And so I was getting really frustrated because, you can try to hum to people. I can't sing. And yet you have these songs. And they're not poetry. I mean, they're clearly lyrics because they have a rhythm and a beat. And you're like, what do I do with these things? Because I can't, I'm not a person, I at that time when I wrote that, again, I had young children, so I'm not going to be, hooking up with musicians and doing the bar scene at night and, where you would normally find musicians who are practicing. And so I had this idea of, I'm just going to put these songs out there for people who have the opposite problem. They know how to play, but they can never think of words to put with their music. And so then I'm providing the words as, a lyricist would, and they're providing the music. And I loved this idea that I could have a book of lyrics with a collection of songs and provide blank bars, so they could actually write the music in the book and use it like a workbook. And I loved the idea that with the same lyrics, different types of musicians could use those same lyrics for all different kinds of songs. So you could have a rock song version and a country song version and who knows, like a reggae version. And all I asked of them was, hey, if you use my song, send me an email, send me an MP3 of it. I would love to hear it. I'm not asking you to pay me any money beyond whatever you pay me for the book. I just wanted to see kind of how my songs went out there into the world. And I really, truly did get back emails from people, and it was very interesting. And they would be like, are you sure I can use this? Yeah, go ahead. Just send me the MP3. And they'd be in Australia. They'd be all over the United States. And I actually met some people in Nashville based on that and, just working with them and talking to them. So it gave me a way to talk to musicians that I would have never otherwise had, just because I chose to do a really unusual book. I didn't really expect to make any money on it. I just kind of put it out there.
Well, I really like that. And that is one of the things I noticed about all of your work is that it is often very, very unique. And those are just two that stand out. I understand that you're also working on a novel.
Yeah, I've been working on my novel for a long time now, but I'm getting there. I would say maybe 3/4 of the way through now. I have a novel called Gateways Through the Penumbra. It's a full-length fantasy novel. And the funny thing is there are several short stories that I've already published that are set in that world. So by the time the actual novel comes out, it has all of these supporting stories for some other happenings and the prequel and the background and things that went on, because those were the stories that came to me first. And then when I realized, this is really about a character and this is a novel and it's going to take me a lot longer to write, then I've been working on it. And I think what happens is the classic case of the cobbler's children have no shoes. As I work on other people's books, and some of the books that I work on are, they're 240 pages. They're full-length books. I work on some shorter books that might be 140 pages, but these are not small projects. And so my own writing, it comes to the, I can have money now, or I can work on my own writing and have money later. And a lot of times money now, it wins. But on the side, when I do feel kind of creative, I go back and I take really good notes for the books, longer things that I write. So I have really good notes about characterization and things that are supposed to happen. I know exactly what needs to happen in every chapter to get to where I want to go. It's really just a matter of when I have time, I sit down and it's like, oh, I have a couple hours. Let me write a chapter. Right. At least the first draft. And then, I kind of wait and say, maybe wait a few weeks later. Okay, let me edit that chapter after it's kind of had a few weeks where I'm not so close to it. And so I kind of make my way through. I also have, classic fantasies tend to turn into trilogies or sometimes even longer or really long books. And so, I kind of set out like, oh, I need this many chapters and it'll probably be like a 300-page book. Well, I suspect that it's probably more than one book to get through the plot that I need to get through. And so I've, sometimes considered, that I could release it as a whole book in the first of a series as it is now. But then I don't want to do that until I have like the whole thing written.
Well, you can always, release a part of it, but I can understand how you might want to have the whole thing done. So of the services that you provide for other people, what are the, let's say, the preferred services that you would like to focus your energies on to help other people?
Right. I enjoy very much editing already existing books. I like the process of taking somebody's rough book. I don't mean editing like proofreading, looking for typos. I mean, you give me your rough book that it's got some issues, but the bones of it are there. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I have a really strong talent for being able to look at somebody's raw material and figure out how to reorganize it and change, and chapterize it and get all your subheadings in that take it from just being this blob of text that is real heavy to read and real slow, and most people wouldn't even get through the first 10 pages of the book, and to be able to get it into a form that makes sense. I'm also very good at just quickly picking out when I work with a lot of people who on the based on a true story side who are talking about things that are controversial. Mm-hmm. So, I'll give you the example. I was working as an editor with a book that was just on the Amazon bestseller. It's called The Verdict Is In: How to Fix the Criminal Justice System. And it's by a lawyer. His name's Jason Swindle Sr., and he's a lawyer in Georgia. It's a controversial subject. It's got political ramifications. It has to do with money. It has to do with what state you're in, and the laws are different. I'm really good at taking somebody's book and very quickly saying, here's where you went too far. Oh. Here's where you need to pull back. Here's where you're too political. Here's where you're I don't know, like sometimes people will be just, too far to the right, too far to the left, to get it so that they can reach the widest audience for their book and still talk about controversial subjects, but actually be listened to. And so that's, one of the types of editing that I do. Now, of course, when I'm editing somebody's book, yes, that means that it's formatted into book format and it's eventually proofread and looked for typos, but that's not really what an editor does. An editor really looks at things like the opening of your book. Does it capture my attention? Do you have a close? Does it make sense from chapter to chapter, or are we jumping around? Things like that a person who's not an experienced writer, they don't even know to look for that.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're absolutely right, because there are different types of editors. There are, there's the copy editor whose job is to go in and look for spelling and typos and grammars. And then there's the editor, like what you're saying, somebody who looks at it for the continuity, for the story, for all of the things that make it a good story, because storytelling is how people need to be marketing themselves today. And I think you've really given a nice perspective of both sides of the writing coin, I guess you would call it the fiction side and the creative side versus the nonfiction side of writing, because they are very, very different types of writing and everything. Well, Kristina, I really, really want to thank you. Is there anything that you would like to say? And definitely let us know how we can find out where to reach you and to find out more about you.
Okay. Well, I did want to answer the last part of your question.
Okay.
In addition to editing, I do take on ghostwriting projects. So sometimes, you have a book in you, but you really are not a writer. And I wanted to clarify, we talked about I might talk with a dentist or a doctor for an hour for a chapter. I do about 5 hours of interviewing for an entire book. And so it's really not a huge time commitment for them to work with me. It's 5 hours of interviewing. They have to spend a little bit of time to read the questions and kind of prepare mentally. And then just when you get your book back, you do have to read it and give any, edits that you need. But compared to writing a book, maybe 10 hours of their time, if you sat down to write that book, it would be hundreds and hundreds of hours. And in being inexperienced at it, it might take you, even if you're dedicated, 6 months or a year. I can usually do a shorter book from beginning to end in 3 months with someone. And that's kind of on the long end. It just depends on how much time they have and if they're traveling in between. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood that if you have a book or you have a message or something, you can work with a ghostwriter, and it does not have to be this years-long process to get your book from beginning to end. And it doesn't have to be hundreds of hours of your time, especially when you're really busy.
That's really good information, because I don't think a lot of people realize that. And I think one of their biggest fears is making that time commitment. And they think that it'll take a lot longer than it actually does. And I think that's a big, big reason why people should work with professional writers and editors, because they have the knowledge and they've already spent all of the years of education and probably hundreds and hundreds of hours reading and understanding about how the written word works. And you cut that learning curve, which is the biggest part of anything that we do that we've never done before. It's that learning curve. And I think a professional editor writer can cut that learning curve, and you actually can create a book that can be a bestseller on Amazon today because of how Amazon bestseller status works on an hour-to-hour basis. So I think that's really good advice. How can we reach you?
Well, right now I would say that Facebook is the best way to reach me. I have an author page on Facebook. I have a regular Facebook. I'm pretty friendly and easy to talk to. A lot of my clients are on Facebook. I do a lot of work online, so it's real comfortable. And it's just my name, Kristina Jacobs. And for Facebook, since I'm sure there's more than one Kristina Jacobs, after my name, it has 1111.
Okay, and that's Kristina with a K.
Yeah, Kristina with a K.
Okay.
J-A-C-O.
And your photograph will be connected to this interview for the show notes, so people will be able to visually recognize you too. Well, again, Kristina, thank you for sharing all of that information, and I hope people reach out to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
This is Tammy Patzer. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.